We know that what we're doing here this morning has been done by Christians for 2,000 years. They gathered every Lord's Day, the day of the resurrection, in order to listen again to the experience of God among them in the person of Jesus. In the very early days, you can be sure the people who came to Mass were listening to the eyewitnesses, those men and women who had experienced Jesus personally and were retelling over the course of many, many Sundays what they had experienced, what Jesus had said, and what he had done. But of course, eyewitnesses die out. And that's when the Gospels, the eyewitness accounts, began to be written down so that the same witness could be done down through the ages as we just heard it this morning in the Gospel reading. The Gospels are the recollection of eyewitnesses. And it's interesting that in the last Gospel written in time, years after the first three, the Gospel of John, which we heard today, in that Gospel, there is this account of in many of the early manuscripts, this account of this woman taken in adultery is not printed. The scribe who copied the Gospel could not bring himself to put this episode into the Gospel. We think that the reason for that is that in the Christian community over the years after Jesus, there was sort of a spirit of rigorism that had set in, a spirit of self-righteousness. And they couldn't just quite handle the ease with which Jesus dealt with this woman in a public sin, taken in adultery. They just couldn't handle it, so they skipped that episode from the Gospel of John. That's the best guess we have as to why it's not there in those early copies. Eventually, of course, other scribes didn't have those scruples, and they began to put it into its place in the Gospel. But that's a danger for us Christians, because having experienced the overwhelming mercy of God for ourselves, having experienced the love of God poured out in the life and death of Jesus, we tend to become self-righteous, which is one of the reasons why I think the church every year has a period of Lent, that we wake up to the fact that what God did for us had to be done because what we did or didn't do according to his will for us. And I think sometimes we as a community or as individual Christians can become self-righteous, holier than thou in respect to other people. I often test myself when something happens that's notorious. For instance, recently I read of a famous churchman who had died, who had committed some really horrible things in his lifetime, which were recently discovered. And my first reaction was, well, that rids the church of him. When my first reaction should have been, according to the mind of Christ, God have mercy on his soul, and prayers for his victims. And you could apply that to political people, church people, or people in our own lives, in our own families, that perhaps we have had falling out with over the years. Is my first instinct that of self-righteousness, or is my first instinct the instinct of Jesus to rejoice in the mercy which God extends to everyone, me first and everyone else? Because in point of fact, and this is why I think this gospel is presented to us at the very end of Lent, we only have 2 more weeks of Lent, is to remind us that Lent isn't about what we're doing for God, what we're doing to make up for our sins, which is a real fallacy. That's already been taken care of by someone else. This is placed here to remind us that our task is to mirror the mercy of God. That Lent is about God's mercy, not our sins. It's about his love for us poured out in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. We are the eyewitnesses today. We're the successors of all those ancestors in the faith to whom Jesus said, go out into the world and tell the good news. And what is the good news? The good news is God's merciful love showing itself in the forgiveness of sin. And what Jesus was asking us to do is, don't go out and talk about it, go out and do it. Go out and forgive each other as my Father has forgiven you in me. We are the witnesses of the good news. We are more gospel than most people will ever read. And we have to be sure that we continue to reflect what we were called to reflect. And if we can't bring ourselves to forgive as we were forgiven, then we better stop saying the Lord's Prayer.